Let's go over Studiometry's ID formats. Now, in addition to names, your clients and projects can also have ID numbers. So if I go to any client in Studiometry, we can see the client's name, and next to it will be the client's ID number. When you create a new client or project, or invoice or report or purchase order in Studiometry, an ID number will automatically be assigned to that item. IDs can be used in many ways in Studiometry. You can have IDs displayed in your list of clients and projects. You can sort and filter your clients and projects based on ID, and it's just a good way to help organize your items. Studiometry gives you the capability to customize what ID number will be assigned so that when you create a new client, you don't have to go in and manually enter an ID number. So let's get started by going to Studiometry's Preferences window and then the ID numbering section. Here we can see rows for each of the item types that Studiometry will automatically generate IDs for. So at the top we have client, and then we have project, invoice, report, and purchase order formats. And then within each row we have several settings. First we have the actual ID format itself, which we'll go into a little more detail after this, but it's really just Studiometry uses this format to generate the ID numbers. And then on the right we have the last number. So the last client ID number that was added was 1124. So when we add the next client, this number will be incremented and that client will be 1125. So that's how it works. Studiometry will just automatically increment these numbers and then apply them to the ID format to create the new ID. So how the ID format works is that Studiometry will check the ID format for any tags that it recognizes, and then it will replace those tags with values. If there are any characters in here that Studiometry doesn't recognize as a tag, it will just leave those alone. So if we wanted to have a prefix for all of our client IDs, we can simply add that. So now with this ID format, the next ID that Studiometry generates will be CL1125 because it will leave the CL in there, and then it will replace the C tag with the next ID number. So that's kind of the simple way that the client ID format works. Now there are several more advanced tags that we can also add to our client ID format. If we wanted to always have the year that the client was created attached to the client ID format, we could do that as well. If you click on the View Tag Descriptions button at the bottom, you can see the list of all the tags that you can add to an ID format. So if we wanted to have the 2-digit year added to the client, we can see that tag here. So if I hit OK, I can add this by just typing it in. So now when this is generated, Studiometry will show CL and then the client number, 1125, and then a dash, and then the 2-digit year. One other common scenario related to client ID formats is if you wanted to always make sure that the ID format was a certain number of digits, and say for example your last number is 1124 but you always want a 6-digit client ID number, you can do that by changing the C tag and adding extra C's within the brackets. So if I just change the entire ID format here to this, every client ID now that is generated will have at least 6 digits. So it will add 2 leading zeros to the next ID number. So that's the client ID format, which is the simplest ID format that we set up here. Now for the project ID format, there's a few more settings. Now that's because projects can be attached to clients. So there's a lot of situations in which you might want your project ID format to include your client ID format. And to do that, all we would do is set it up like is shown here. The C will, when it's inside of the project ID format, this tag will pull whatever the client's ID is and insert it into the project ID when the project is created. And then after that, the P tag will generate the project ID number based on the project's last number. So in this example, if we were to use this project ID format and add a new project to the client whose ID was 001124, the project's ID format would pull that client ID number and then add the project ID number after that. So now if we don't want the client ID to appear within the project ID when the project is created, we can just go into our ID format here and remove this. And then in this instance, the next project that is created will simply have the ID number 1154 because it will add one to this and there's nothing else in the ID format. And now let's look over here at the behavior. The behavior of the project ID format, if we click here, we can see there are two options, program-wide and per client. Now, program-wide means that this last number is program-wide. So when you add a new project, it will always just increment this number by 1, and each project will have a sequential ID number. If we change this to per client, then each client will have a start number, and every project that's added to that client will start at that number and increment from there. So there could be 2 projects with the same ID number, but they would be associated with different clients. So this is just a way to basically, if you set it as per client, then you can see each project that was created for that client based on the ID number. And if we wanted to just have unique IDs throughout the program, we would set it to program wide. So if you want to use the per client setting, I would definitely recommend making sure that you have the client's ID number somewhere within the project ID format. So if we put the C back in here, then the per client setting will make a little more sense because it'll have the client ID format, then a dash, and then the project ID number. And that way you'll make sure that you don't have any duplicate project IDs. So next is the invoice, report, and purchase order formats. Now all 3 of these items are attached to projects, so that means we can go another level further. If we go to the behavior, we can see we have program-wide, per client, and per project for all of these. So for each of these, we can create an ID format based on either a program-wide format, or we can have a number that starts for each project or a number that starts for each client. So if, for example, for each invoice that we create, for every project, we want our invoices to start at number 1 and go up from there, we can do that. So we would just set it to per project, and then we can set the start number here. So with this ID format, Studiometry will create new invoices for projects at number 1, and then the second invoice for that project would be number 2. And then if you create another project, the first invoice for that project would be number 1. Now obviously the problem with that is that if we just have the I as the invoice format, then the only thing in it will be the number. So what might make more sense is to include the project ID in the invoice ID format, and to do that we would just put the P tag here. Now, as we can see, it's getting a little complicated here because the project ID format includes the client and project ID. And then the invoice ID format includes the project ID format, which includes both of those. So this P tag will include the client's ID format, and then the dash, and then the project's ID format. And then after that, we'll also have the invoice ID. So we can kind of set up some nesting here where the items that we get into further down in the hierarchy of Studiometry's data format can include a lot of information about their parents' ID numbers. One other thing we want to note is that since in this example the project ID format has the client's ID and the project's ID, we don't need to come in here and put a C for the client ID format. If we did that, then Studiometry would show the client ID, which is here, and then it would show the project ID, which would then again include the client ID format and the project ID. So basically just be careful and make sure that you don't put your C tag in your invoice and your project ID formats, because then you'll have some duplication of ID numbers when you generate the invoice ID. So that's the invoice ID format. And now for reports and purchase orders, you have the same options to have it program-wide, per client, or per project. And you can set up the ID format and determine which other fields that it might pull in when generating a new ID. So these 3 items on the bottom are the most complex in that you can have the project or the client ID format included into the invoice, report, or purchase order format. But again, if you wanted to just have a simple incrementing invoice ID format that is program-wide, you could very easily set that up. I could just switch this back to program-wide and then change the ID format to just I, and then all this will do is the next ID that's created, or the next invoice that's created, the number will be 1142. That's it. That's the only thing that will appear in the ID. So you have control over what you show in your ID formats, and really the complex options are there if you want to use them. Some people like to set up very intricate ID formats that include their client and project ID and various other pieces of information. But the built-in defaults for Studiometry are they'll just assign a number. So it's really, if you need to do this or you want to make your ID formats a little more complex, you can definitely do so. One thing to note, though, is all of these formats here, they only apply to newly created items. So if we change any of these formats, it will not affect any existing information in Studiometry. It will only affect the next item that's created. And lastly, now at the bottom here, we have the project combined name and ID format. This is a little bit different than the other fields. This is really just used in Studiometry for display purposes. What you can do with this is determine how a combined name and ID will appear for your projects. So when you create a new project, the ID format will be used to generate the ID for that. But there are various parts of the program where Studiometry will display projects based on their name and ID in one list. So you can set up how it's displayed here. If you wanted to, for example, display the project with the ID first and then the name, we can just move this around to have it display however we'd like. And now I'll show you where this is used in Studiometry really quick. If we go to Studiometry's main window and we click on the gear icon in the bottom left and select View Settings, we can check the project display here. We can have the custom formatted ID and name, and that will use whatever format that we set in the Preferences window there. So when I hit Apply, it'll tell us that that will appear the next time we load the list. And now we can see here the project ID and then a dash and then the name is shown in this list. So if I go back to the Preferences window, we can see the combined name and ID format here is ID and then a dash and then a name. So we can change this to be basically however we'd like to display in locations like this and various other lists throughout the program. Now this is obviously a lot of information to take on all at once, and the ID formatting is a pretty advanced section of Studiometry. So if you have any questions about the ID formatting or you need help setting up some type of an ID format, please feel free to get a hold of us at support.oranged.net.